The cruelest thing power can steal isn't your freedom. It's your dignity, especially when everyone is watching. On a cool Monday morning, just outside downtown Richmond, Virginia, Naomi Carter glanced at the dashboard clock and smiled to herself. She had exactly 18 minutes before her appointment across town, enough time to stop for coffee if traffic stayed light. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, the kind that disappears into memory before the sun even sets. The streets were already filling with commuters, school buses rolled through quiet neighborhoods, and people hurried along sidewalks carrying cups of coffee and unfinished conversations. Naomi had lived long enough to appreciate mornings like this because they reminded her that peace often arrived disguised as routine. She kept her hands steady on the steering wheel, her favorite jazz station playing softly through the speakers, unaware that within the next hour strangers would begin telling her story without ever asking who she really was. Flashing blue lights suddenly appeared in her rearview mirror. Naomi eased her sedan safely onto the shoulder, switched off the engine, lowered her window, and rested both hands where they could be clearly seen. She knew the routine. She also knew how quickly ordinary moments could become complicated. Officer Daniel Briggs approached with measured confidence, while Sergeant Mark Collins remained a few steps behind, silently observing everything around them. Their expressions carried an unmistakable certainty, the kind that often arrives before a single word has been spoken. Naomi greeted them politely and answered every question calmly. Her driver's license, registration, and insurance card were already prepared. Nothing about her voice suggested anger. Nothing about her movements suggested resistance. Yet the atmosphere continued to grow heavier with every passing second. Curious drivers slowed as they passed. A few pedestrians paused across the street. Someone lifted a phone, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Naomi noticed, but kept her attention forward. She had learned years ago that dignity sometimes begins with refusing to surrender your composure. The conversation shifted in a direction that made less and less sense, and the officers issued an instruction that left the growing crowd exchanging confused glances. Naomi looked directly at Officer Briggs, searching his face for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding, but his expression never changed. The request carried the weight of authority, even though it felt deeply humiliating. For several long moments, the world seemed to fall completely silent except for distant traffic and the wind brushing through nearby trees. Every eye waited for her reaction. Some expected outrage. Others expected fear. Naomi offered neither. She stood quietly, her shoulders straight, her breathing steady, protecting the one thing no one else could protect for her, her self-respect. She understood that some moments define a life, not because of what is taken away, but because of how a person chooses to stand when the entire world seems eager to watch them fall. As the crowd continued recording, whispers spread from one person to another, each version drifting further from the truth. Officer Briggs believed the moment confirmed his authority. Sergeant Collins believed the situation would soon be forgotten. Neither man realized they were witnessing the first chapter of a story that would eventually bring every decision they made into the brightest light imaginable. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a heartbeat before looking back at them with remarkable calm. Her voice never rose above a conversation, yet every word landed with quiet certainty. "I hope," she said, "that when the truth finally arrives, every person standing here remembers exactly what they chose to see today." By late afternoon, the roadside encounter had already escaped the boundaries of the street where it happened. Short video clips began appearing across social media, each one capturing only fragments of the moment, never the entire truth. Millions of people formed opinions within seconds. Some viewers expressed heartbreak. Others insisted there had to be details missing. Comment sections became battlefields where strangers argued over a woman none of them had ever met. Television stations replayed carefully edited footage while online commentators filled the missing spaces with speculation. Naomi Carter watched none of it. She returned to her apartment, closed the front door behind her, and allowed herself a long moment of silence before placing her keys on the kitchen counter. The quiet inside her home felt almost unreal compared to the noise consuming the outside world. She stood before the bathroom mirror, studying her own reflection without anger or self-pity. What had changed was visible. What had not changed mattered far more. Her character, her discipline, and her belief that dignity could survive humiliation remained untouched. She gently rested both hands on the edge of the sink and whispered to herself, "Do not let today decide who you become tomorrow." The following morning, reporters gathered outside her apartment complex, hoping for a statement. Microphones waited. Cameras remained pointed toward the entrance for hours. Naomi walked past them without saying a single word. She did not accuse anyone. She did not defend herself. She simply entered her car and drove away. To many people, her silence seemed mysterious. To those who truly understood patience, it revealed extraordinary strength. Across town, Officer Daniel Briggs arrived at the precinct carrying himself with the same confidence he had displayed the previous day. A few co-workers joked that the public would soon move on to another headline. Sergeant Mark Collins reviewed routine paperwork and assured everyone that internal questions would disappear once emotion settled. Neither man realized that every hour of silence allowed something much stronger than outrage to grow. Facts were quietly finding one another. Witnesses who had never met began contacting attorneys. Drivers who had passed the scene discovered that their dashboard cameras had recorded more than they originally noticed. Store owners checked security systems facing nearby intersections. Individual pieces of an ordinary Monday slowly assembled into a picture no single person had expected. That afternoon, Naomi walked into the office of attorney Michael Hayes. There were no dramatic speeches and no emotional outbursts. She placed a neatly organized folder on his conference table containing timelines, receipts, phone records, and handwritten notes documenting every minute she could remember. Michael looked at the material before looking back at her. "You started preparing this immediately?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded. "The truth has one advantage," she answered. "It never has to remember a different version." Michael leaned back in thoughtful silence. Years of practicing law had taught him that calm clients often carried the strongest cases because they focused on evidence instead of emotion. Before the meeting ended, he offered one final question. "Are you looking for revenge?" Naomi looked through the office window toward the courthouse standing several blocks away. Sunlight reflected across its stone columns as people entered and exited without realizing their lives might soon intersect with hers. She answered with complete certainty. "No, I am looking for accountability. There is a difference, and eventually everyone will see it." Outside, another news alert appeared on thousands of phones across the country. But while the headlines continued chasing attention, something far more powerful had already begun. Quiet preparation was slowly overtaking loud assumptions, and the story was no longer moving toward public opinion. It was moving toward a courtroom, where certainty would no longer belong to the loudest voice, but to the strongest truth. The week that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm that only Naomi Carter seemed prepared to endure. While commentators competed for attention and social media continued arguing over fragments of the story, she disappeared from public view almost completely. Friends encouraged her to defend herself in interviews. Community leaders offered to organize rallies in her support. Even strangers wrote letters urging her to speak before someone else controlled the narrative forever. Naomi thanked each person with quiet sincerity, but she declined every invitation. She understood something that many people forgot during moments of public outrage. A courtroom rewarded evidence, not emotion. Every unnecessary word spoken outside. Those walls created another opportunity for the truth to become blurred. Instead, she devoted each day to preparation. Every receipt was placed in chronological order. Every phone record was carefully preserved. Every memory was written down before time could soften its edges. Attorney Michael Hayes watched the process with growing respect. He had represented determined clients before, but very few possessed Naomi's discipline. She never speculated. She never filled empty spaces with assumptions. Whenever she could not verify a detail, she simply left it unanswered. To Michael, that restraint was more convincing than any dramatic statement could ever be. Together, they reconstructed the entire day minute by minute until the timeline became almost impossible to challenge. Then another breakthrough quietly arrived. An investigator hired by Michael visited businesses located along the same stretch of road where the traffic stop had occurred. Most cameras had captured only distant angles, but one small pharmacy had upgraded its exterior security system only weeks earlier. The manager agreed to preserve the recording after learning that legal proceedings were likely. Although the footage contained no audio, it clearly documented the sequence of events, the positions of everyone present, and the length of the encounter with remarkable precision. Michael replayed the recording several times before slowly removing his glasses. Nothing about it resembled the simplified version already circulating in official paperwork. The timeline raised new questions that demanded clear answers. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Briggs continued believing the controversy would eventually fade. At the precinct, conversations had already shifted toward other assignments. Sergeant Mark Collins reminded younger officers that public criticism often disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Their confidence rested on familiarity. They had seen headlines come and go before, and they expected this situation to follow the same pattern. What they did not realize was that this case was no longer being driven by headlines. It was being built document by document, witness by witness, until every independent piece supported the next. One afternoon, Michael spread the complete collection across his conference table. Photographs, certified records, written statements, surveillance images, and carefully organized timelines covered nearly every available inch. He looked toward Naomi with quiet admiration. Most people spend their energy trying to win the public, he said. You spent yours making certain the facts could stand on their own. Naomi looked through the office window toward the courthouse, standing several blocks away beneath the afternoon sun. People walked up its wide stone steps without realizing how much hope those doors represented for someone whose dignity had been questioned in public. She folded her hands calmly before answering. The truth does not become stronger because more people believe it, she said softly. It becomes stronger because it remains the truth even when nobody does. Michael nodded without another word. At that moment, both of them understood that the coming courtroom battle would not depend on louder voices or sharper arguments. It would depend on patience, preparation, and the quiet power of undeniable facts. And for the first time since that unforgettable morning, Naomi felt that justice was no longer a distant possibility. It was slowly, steadily walking toward her. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived beneath a gray Virginia sky that seemed to hold its breath along with everyone else. Long before the courthouse doors opened, television vans lined the street. Reporters rehearsed their introductions, and curious residents gathered behind the barricades, hoping to witness the latest chapter of a story that had already divided the nation. Yet inside a quiet sedan parked 2 blocks away, Naomi Carter remained completely still. She rested a legal notebook on her lap without opening it, listening only to the faint sound of rain tapping against the windshield. She had imagined this day many times over the previous weeks, but now that it had finally arrived, she discovered something unexpected. Fear had slowly given way to clarity. She was no longer walking into the courthouse to defend her reputation. She was walking into let carefully preserved facts speak louder than assumptions ever could. Attorney Michael Hayes glanced toward her before turning off the engine. The cameras will be waiting, he said gently. Naomi offered a calm smile. They have been waiting for weeks. Today they can wait for the truth. Together, they entered the courthouse without stopping for questions. Microphones stretched toward them. Reporters called Naomi by name. Flashing cameras followed every step across the marble entrance. She acknowledged no one, keeping the same steady pace that had carried her through every difficult moment since that Monday morning. Across the building, Officer Daniel Briggs and Sergeant Mark Collins arrived through a separate entrance reserved for law enforcement personnel. Briggs adjusted his tie and exchanged a confident nod with several colleagues. He believed the hearing would be procedural, brief, and largely uneventful. His attorney had assured him that public attention often exaggerated ordinary legal disputes. Collins shared the same confidence, reminding everyone that official reports carried significant weight inside a courtroom. Neither man noticed how differently Michael Hayes viewed the day. He carried only one slim leather briefcase, but inside rested weeks of disciplined preparation organized with remarkable precision. Every document had been indexed. Every photograph had been authenticated. Every recorded timestamp aligned with witness statements gathered independently from people who had never spoken to one another. As they entered Courtroom 3, the atmosphere felt surprisingly restrained. There were no dramatic confrontations and no raised voices. Spectators quietly filled the wooden benches while court staff prepared the room with practiced efficiency. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered, and the entire courtroom rose in respectful silence. Her reputation for fairness extended far beyond Richmond. She rarely displayed emotion from the bench, but she expected accuracy, professionalism, and honesty from everyone who appeared before her. After everyone was seated, preliminary matters began with routine introductions and scheduling. Discussion. The proceedings moved deliberately, almost quietly, giving the impression that nothing extraordinary was about to happen. Briggs occasionally glanced toward Naomi, expecting frustration or resentment to appear on her face. Instead, he found only composure. She took careful notes, listened attentively, and never reacted to whispered conversations around her. That quiet confidence unsettled him more than any angry accusation could have. Judge Whitmore reviewed the filings already submitted and looked thoughtfully at both legal teams before speaking. This court expects complete transparency from every party involved, she said evenly. Facts will determine the outcome of this matter. Assumptions will not. Her words echoed through the courtroom with remarkable weight. Naomi lowered her pen for a brief moment and met Michael's eyes. Neither of them spoke, because they both understood the significance of what had just been said. For the first time since the encounter on the roadside, the case no longer belonged to public opinion, online debates, or television headlines. It belonged to the law, and the law was finally ready to listen. As the hearing moved beyond procedural matters, the atmosphere inside Courtroom 3 changed so gradually that almost no one noticed it at first. Pens stopped moving. Quiet whispers faded into complete silence. Judge Eleanor Whitmore leaned slightly forward as attorney Michael Hayes requested permission to begin presenting the initial foundation of Naomi Carter's evidence. There was nothing dramatic about his tone. He spoke with measured confidence, placing one carefully labeled folder after another onto the counsel table. Each document had been organized weeks earlier, long before public opinion had settled into competing narratives. Michael understood that credibility was built one verified fact at a time. He began with the official incident report submitted by Officer Daniel Briggs. Every sentence was read exactly as written. The report described the sequence of events with complete certainty, presenting a version that appeared orderly and straightforward. When Michael finished reading, he thanked the court and quietly placed the report beside a large printed timeline displayed on an easel. "Your Honor," he said, "the timeline supported by independent records does not fully correspond with the timeline contained in the official report." Judge Whitmore looked toward the exhibit before nodding for him to continue. Michael introduced certified phone records, dispatch logs, and publicly maintained traffic camera timestamps. None of those records depended upon memory. None of them relied upon personal interpretation. They simply recorded when events occurred. As each timestamp appeared on the courtroom monitors, subtle differences began emerging. Minutes that seemed insignificant on paper suddenly carried enormous importance. A dispatch log placed one communication several minutes earlier than described in the report. A traffic camera confirmed the position of vehicles during a period that had previously remained uncertain. A witness statement submitted independently matched the camera record with remarkable consistency. Michael never suggested conclusions. He simply allowed every verified document to speak for itself. Officer Daniel Briggs remained composed, but his confidence no longer appeared effortless. He quietly reviewed his own copy of the exhibits while occasionally exchanging brief glances with defense counsel. Sergeant Mark Collins maintained a professional expression, although he too began taking more frequent notes than before. Neither officer interrupted the presentation because every exhibit had already been properly disclosed according to court procedure. Spectators watched the evidence unfold with growing attention. There were no emotional reactions, only the unmistakable feeling that the case was becoming far more complex than anyone had expected. Naomi sat quietly beside Michael, listening with complete focus. She never looked toward the gallery. She never reacted to the changing expressions around the courtroom. Weeks earlier, she had promised herself that patience would remain stronger than frustration, and she intended to keep that promise until the very end. After another series of authenticated exhibits had been admitted into the record, Judge Whitmore paused to review several pages herself. The courtroom remained completely silent except for the sound of paper turning beneath her hands. Finally, she looked up and addressed both legal teams. "Accuracy is essential in every proceeding before this court," she said evenly. "When independent evidence raises questions regarding previously submitted accounts, this court has an obligation to examine those questions carefully." Her words were neither accusatory nor sympathetic. They reflected only the responsibility carried by the bench. Yet everyone inside the courtroom understood their significance. For the first time since the hearing had begun, certainty shifted ever so slightly away from assumptions and toward documentation. Michael closed one folder and reached for another. He knew the strongest evidence had not yet been presented. Across the room, Naomi folded her hands calmly on the table and took one slow breath. The foundation had now been laid exactly as planned, and with every verified record added to the case, the distance between appearance and truth continued to grow smaller. The courtroom remained almost unnaturally quiet as Attorney Michael Hayes returned to the lectern with another carefully organized folder in his hands. The earlier exhibits had not produced dramatic reactions, but they had accomplished something far more important. They had replaced certainty with questions. Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked toward Michael and gave a slight nod for him to continue. He thanked the court before introducing the next group of exhibits, explaining that each item had been independently authenticated and preserved according to established legal procedure. One by one, certified surveillance images appeared on the courtroom monitors. They came from different locations along the same roadway, captured by cameras that had never been intended to become part of a courtroom proceeding. Yet together, they created a continuous sequence that neither memory nor opinion could easily dispute. Michael carefully walked through each image using nothing more than recorded times and verified locations. There were no dramatic accusations. There was only patience. Every minute connected naturally to the next until the timeline became remarkably clear. Judge Whitmore occasionally made notes while comparing the exhibits with the official report already admitted into evidence. Several differences that had once appeared insignificant now carried increasing importance because they repeated themselves across multiple independent sources. A single inconsistency might have been explained as an honest mistake. Several independent inconsistencies pointing in the same direction demanded closer examination. Across the room, Officer Daniel Briggs shifted slightly in his chair. It was a small movement that most people would never have noticed, but Naomi Carter did. She did not look at him with satisfaction or resentment. Instead, she quietly returned her attention to the evidence displayed before the court. She had promised herself that she would never allow emotion to distract from the truth, especially now that the truth no longer depended upon her words alone. Michael then introduced testimony from two witnesses who had never met each other before the hearing. Their written statements had been collected days apart, yet both described key moments with striking consistency. Neither witness claimed to know everything that happened. Neither attempted to speculate. They simply described exactly what they had personally observed. Their accounts aligned closely with the surveillance footage already before the court. Michael paused after reading the final statement. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "every exhibit presented today has come from a separate source. None relies upon another for its accuracy. Yet together, they describe the same sequence of events." Judge Whitmore rested her pen on the bench and looked carefully through the collection of documents before responding. "The court recognizes the significance of corroborating evidence," she said evenly. "When independent records consistently support one another, they deserve careful consideration." Those words carried a quiet weight that reached every corner of the courtroom. Reporters sitting in the gallery immediately began writing fresh notes. Observers who had arrived expecting an ordinary procedural hearing now leaned forward with complete attention. The atmosphere had changed. Confidence no longer belonged automatically to official titles or prepared reports. It belonged to whatever could be verified. Michael returned to counsel table and exchanged a brief glance with Naomi. No words were necessary. They both understood that the foundation was now complete. The evidence had established not merely isolated facts, but a pattern that invited deeper examination. Judge Whitmore closed one exhibit binder before addressing both parties once more. "This court will continue reviewing all submitted materials with the utmost care," she said. "The integrity of these proceedings depends upon complete transparency from every individual involved." As silence settled once again over the courtroom, Naomi slowly folded her hands together and looked toward the bench. The moment she had quietly prepared for over many difficult weeks was finally approaching, and although no final decision had yet been reached, she could feel the balance beginning to shift. The truth had entered the room without raising its voice, and somehow that made it impossible to ignore. Judge Eleanor Whitmore reviewed the final page before gently closing the binder in front of her. The quiet sound echoed through the courtroom with surprising force because nobody seemed willing to breathe until she spoke again. Every exhibit introduced throughout the morning had shifted the focus away from assumptions and toward verifiable facts. Attorney Michael Hayes remained standing, waiting patiently. He understood that the next few minutes could shape the entire direction of the case. Across the aisle, Officer Daniel Briggs sat perfectly still, his earlier confidence replaced by careful attention. Sergeant Mark Collins kept his eyes fixed on the documents before him, no longer glancing toward the gallery. The atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be measured by words alone. It felt as though the courtroom itself had become smaller, drawing every person closer to the same unavoidable question. What had really happened that morning beside the roadway? Judge Whitmore finally looked up from the bench. "Counsel," she said calmly, "before this court proceeds further, I would like clarification regarding one remaining matter." Michael nodded respectfully. "Of course, Your Honor." She tapped a single page near the center of the evidence binder. Several independent records establish a consistent timeline. However, there appears to be an additional exhibit referenced here that has not yet been discussed. Michael answered without hesitation. "That is correct, Your Honor. We intentionally reserved that exhibit until the supporting foundation had been fully established." A quiet murmur passed through the spectators before disappearing almost immediately beneath the judge's watchful expression. She waited until complete silence returned. "Very well," she said. "The court will permit you to proceed." Michael did not immediately reach for another document. Instead, he turned toward Naomi Carter. Their eyes met for only a brief moment, but years of discipline and weeks of preparation seemed to pass silently between them. He spoke in an even voice. "Ms. Carter, would you please approach the witness area?" Naomi rose without urgency. The sound of her shoes against the polished courtroom floor became the only noise anyone could hear. Every step seemed measured, steady, and completely free of hesitation. Reporters lowered their pens. Spectators leaned forward. Even Officer Briggs found himself watching her approach instead of the judge. Naomi stopped exactly where instructed and folded her hands calmly before her. Judge Whitmore regarded her with quiet professionalism. "Ms. Carter, your attorney has indicated that the next exhibit requires your direct participation. Are you prepared to proceed?" Naomi answered with the same composure that had defined every moment since the case began. "Yes, Your Honor." Michael walked toward the evidence table and carefully removed a sealed envelope bearing the certification markings required by the court. He held it without opening it immediately. "Your Honor, before introducing its contents, I would like the record to reflect that this exhibit was obtained through lawful process, independently authenticated, and preserved without alteration." Judge Whitmore reviewed the accompanying certification before nodding. "The record will so reflect." Michael placed the sealed envelope on the presentation table where everyone in the courtroom could see it, yet no one could see what it contained. The room grew even quieter than before. Nobody whispered. Nobody shifted in their seat. The silence no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to anticipation. Naomi remained standing with remarkable calm, her attention fixed not on the spectators or the officers across the room, but on the bench where the law would soon decide what the evidence truly meant. Officer Briggs slowly lowered his eyes toward the unopened envelope, and for the first time since the proceedings had begun, certainty seemed to leave his expression altogether. Attorney Michael Hayes waited several long seconds before breaking the seal on the certified envelope. No one inside Courtroom 3 seemed willing to interrupt the silence. Judge Eleanor Whitmore watched every movement with careful attention while the court reporter prepared to record the next exchange. Michael removed a single storage device together with its chain of custody documentation and handed both to the court clerk for verification. Every signature was examined. Every certification was confirmed. Only after the clerk acknowledged that the records were complete did Judge Whitmore authorize the exhibit to be displayed. The courtroom monitor slowly illuminated with footage that had never been released publicly. It was not dramatic. It was not edited. It was simply a continuous recording preserved exactly as it had been captured. The video quietly documented the roadside encounter from an angle no one had previously discussed. It showed the positions of every person present, the sequence of movements, and the amount of time that passed between each event. Without commentary or narration, the recording aligned almost perfectly with the independent timelines already admitted into evidence. Michael spoke only to identify the timestamps as they appeared. He asked no emotional questions and made no accusations. The evidence required neither. Judge Whitmore requested that several portions be replayed at normal speed. Each review confirmed the same chronology established by dispatch records, surveillance cameras, and witness statements. The consistency across unrelated sources became impossible to ignore. Officer Daniel Briggs remained silent throughout the presentation. Earlier confidence had gradually given way to careful concentration as he watched the screen. Sergeant Mark Collins reviewed his own notes several times before quietly setting his pen down. Neither officer interrupted because every frame being shown had already been authenticated according to court procedure. The gallery remained completely still. Even the reporters, who had arrived expecting dramatic testimony, understood that the most persuasive moment of the hearing contained almost no words at all. Facts were speaking for themselves. After the recording concluded, Michael approached the lectern once more. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "the purpose of introducing this exhibit is not to inflame emotion. It is to demonstrate that every independent source presented before this court points toward the same objective sequence of events." Judge Whitmore looked once more through the exhibits before turning her attention to both legal teams. "The court recognizes that the cumulative weight of corroborating evidence must be evaluated carefully," she said. "When multiple independent records consistently support one another, their collective reliability becomes highly significant." Those measured words carried enormous meaning. They were not a final ruling, but they marked a turning point that everyone in the courtroom understood. The discussion was no longer centered upon competing narratives. It had become an examination of verified facts. Naomi Carter stood quietly beside the witness area with the same composure she had carried since the first day of the proceedings. She did not celebrate the moment or look toward the officers across the room. She simply listened, trusting the process she had respected from the beginning. Michael slowly returned the storage device to the evidence table after the court clerk completed the record. He knew there was nothing more to add through argument. The documents, recordings, and timelines had formed a single consistent picture. Judge Whitmore closed the evidence binder and rested her hands upon it for a thoughtful moment before addressing the courtroom. "This matter will proceed based upon the evidence properly admitted into the record," she said. "The court will issue its determinations according to the law and the verified facts before it." As those words settled across the silent courtroom, Naomi took one slow breath. Weeks earlier, she had walked into the building carrying little more than patience and truth. Now those two qualities had quietly become the strongest voices in the room. Judge Eleanor Whitmore returned to the bench after a brief recess, and the entire courtroom rose once again before settling into complete silence. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, stretching across the polished wooden floor as though time itself had slowed to witness the final moments of the hearing. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been, her posture calm, her expression steady, showing neither triumph nor resentment. Attorney Michael Hayes quietly organized the last of his documents, although everyone in the room understood that no additional exhibits were necessary. The evidence had already spoken with remarkable consistency. Judge Whitmore adjusted the papers before her and began reading her findings in a measured voice that carried effortlessly throughout the courtroom. She explained that the court's responsibility was not to reward emotion or punish public opinion. Its responsibility was to examine verified facts, evaluate credible evidence, and apply the law with fairness to every individual who entered the courtroom. She noted that multiple independent sources, collected separately and authenticated according to proper legal procedures, had consistently supported the same sequence of events. She further explained that when official accounts materially differed from corroborated evidence, those differences demanded serious legal scrutiny. The courtroom remained completely still. Reporters stopped typing. Spectators leaned forward without realizing it. Even Officer Daniel Briggs and Sergeant Mark Collins listened without distraction. Judge Whitmore concluded that the evidence presented established sufficient grounds for the matter to proceed through the appropriate legal process and ordered that the disputed actions and related official reports receive further judicial review under the applicable standards. She also directed that the complete evidentiary record be preserved without alteration for all future proceedings. Although her ruling did not resolve every legal issue that remained ahead, it represented something equally important. The truth had earned its place within the justice system. No headline could erase it. No assumption could replace it. As the hearing officially concluded, the gavel sounded once, firm but unhurried. People slowly began rising from their seats, yet almost no one spoke. The silence filling the courtroom felt different from the silence that had surrounded Naomi on the roadside weeks earlier. That silence had been filled with uncertainty. This one carried understanding. Michael gathered his folders before quietly turning toward Naomi. He smiled with quiet respect rather than celebration. "You trusted the process," he said softly. Naomi looked toward the bench one final time before answering. "I trusted the truth to survive long enough to reach it." Outside the courthouse, reporters again waited with cameras and microphones prepared for dramatic statements. Naomi walked through the courthouse doors beneath the afternoon sky exactly as she had entered earlier that morning, without anger, without bitterness, and without the need to raise her voice. She paused briefly at the top of the courthouse steps, taking a slow breath as a gentle breeze crossed the plaza. Her hair had not yet grown back, but something far greater had already returned. The dignity that others had tried to diminish now stood before the entire community, stronger than ever. Around her, people who had once rushed to judgment watched in thoughtful silence, perhaps recognizing that appearances often speak first while truth arrives later. Naomi descended the steps beside Michael and disappeared into the crowd, no longer defined by the worst day of her life, but by the grace with which she had endured it. Long after the courthouse emptied and the television crews packed away their equipment, one lesson remained behind like an echo within those marble walls. Authority may command attention for a moment, but integrity commands respect for a lifetime. In the end, the truth did not need a shout. It only needed the chance to be heard.